All right, everybody. So I promised towards the beginning of the year that we would break with some of the typical content. We would expand it. We would start to have conversations not only with other content creators, but also professional political strategists. And I happen to bag one here. I've got Doug Wilson, founder of Alexander Wilson Consulting, a
Mhm,
man on a mission to change North Carolina or emphasize the changes that have been
mhm,
made to North Carolina. How you doing,
mhm.
Doug?
I'm doing good today, Josiah. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Mhm,
Listen, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You have a
mhm,
very complex mission ahead of you in a state which I think is
mhm,
very misunderstood in terms of its
mhm,
political leanings from the outside.
mhm,
So, can you
mhm.
give an overview of who you are and what your mission is with respect to North Carolina?
Sure. Well, like you mentioned, my name is Douglas Wilson. I go by Doug for short. I've been in North Carolina now for about, I would say, 20 plus years. I'm originally from New York, from Jamaica, Queens. Was born there, raised there. My parents decided to move to South Carolina when I was in high school, and I finished up, started, I went to high school in South Carolina and then graduated there and went to University of South Carolina, and then I got involved in politics and moved to Charlotte in 2001. Just kind of giving you a
Mhm.
quick overview. But I got involved in politics first, working for Barack Obama's first campaign, which really taught me a lot about politics and a lot about connecting with voters and how to build those relationships that is needed, not just to win elections, but also to outlast the campaign that will last for decades. So I worked for Barack Obama on his first campaign, worked for the state party here as their deputy executive director, worked for Kay Hagan as their political director. And in 2020, I was one of the senior advisors to the Biden Harris campaign here in North Carolina. And I also, last campaign I did was I was a senior advisor to Congressman Jeff Jackson's campaign for Congress. And so my mission is to try to one make sure that North Carolina becomes a battleground state, really live up to that, and two, to make sure that we're able to deliver the state to Democrats. I am a Democrat, so I want to speak from the Democratic perspective here. And we just want North Carolina to live up to its history of being more of a progressive state in the South. And what I mean by progressive, I don't mean that this we're trying to push the state far left. We're trying to actually have the state live up to its creed and its motto. That 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 education should be something that we invest in more here, and that our jobs should be more plentiful here. And we've had a lot of jobs coming in, but the mission that's pretty much the mission here is to flip this state and to help the state live up to its aims.
Well, that's great. And there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, because
Mhm,
so full disclosure to the audience, which I've mentioned this in previous videos, even though the channel is not about my personal history. I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina in July 2022. I love this state. It's a beautiful state. Charlotte is, in my opinion, the best city I've ever lived in, the best city I've ever seen. It's beautiful. It's stunning. It's constantly
mhm,
growing. So I'm
mhm,
excited to see North Carolina also become more
mhm,
progressive and in terms of political affiliation, swing
mhm,
more towards the Democrats, or at the very least, rebalance to reflect the
mhm,
state's composition. Because, you said that the goal is to make North Carolina a battleground state, or to at least to live up to the status of a battleground state. And what's interesting is it's kind of a quasi battleground state
it is.
already in some
It is.
respects and not in others.
Mhm.
My
Yeah.
understanding is that so President Obama won North Carolina. We're
Mhm.
talking about macro politics for
Mhm,
the
mhm,
audience. We'll get into some of the state particulars, but
mhm.
in terms of electors, President Obama won in 2008. So it's not like a
He did.
Democrat has never won here,
Mhm,
but it tends to swing more for the Republicans. So
mhm,
set, I guess, local politics and state politics aside, looking at the national level, given that I think in 2020 it was relatively close between
it
Joe
was.
Biden and then
It
President
was.
Trump, what do
Mhm.
you think? Is there serious potential? Is it possible that if not in this election cycle, perhaps in the next one, we could see the electors go back to a Democratic candidate?
It is very possible because what's happening in North Carolina is, like you mentioned, and you're a good example of this. We're having a population boom in the state right now. We have, if you look in Charlotte, like I live here in Charlotte, every day I'm seeing a New York license plate driving around. I'm seeing a Massachusetts license plates. I'm seeing Ohio license plates. So we have folks moving from the Midwest, from up north down here. I have friends and family in Charlotte. I mean in New York that says, "Oh yeah, I've heard of Charlotte. I know friends that are moving down there." So the population growth in Charlotte, in the Triangle, in Greensboro, and a lot of our cities is booming. And the more and more that growth happens, the more those individuals are going to start to not just live in Raleigh proper or in Charlotte proper, but start living in those counties surrounding those those areas. And so I believe that the way that Democrats can be successful here this year is they have to do two things. One, and it sounds very generic and very simple, but it's really not. They will have to drive up turnout in Charlotte, in Wake, in Greensboro, in particular in Charlotte, to I would say maybe 300,000 votes. Because right now, Democratic candidates that run statewide are averaging about 65 to 67% of the vote. And to your listeners and viewers, they would think, well, that's a pretty good number. And it is. But when you have a population here that's close to 1 million people, that 67% is netting you about 235,000 votes. So the Democrats are still winning Mecklenburg, but the amount of voters that are voting in Mecklenburg for Democrats is not enough to offset the huge losses Democrats get in rural North Carolina, which goes to my next point, is that the Biden campaign and the Stein campaign will have to go to rural North Carolina, go to some of those counties, knowing that they're not going to win, knowing that people are going to be like, "Why are you here?" But if they can increase Democratic Performance Index in those areas, basically what that means is how well a Democrat does in a given election in a county, from 35%, which is about the average amount of votes Democrats get out of rural counties, to say 37, 38, you're still losing it, but you're adding to your vote total. We saw this in Georgia. The reason why John Ossoff was able to win his race, the reason why that Raphael Warnock was able to win his race, is because they outperformed in Atlanta and cut their losses in North Georgia, South. I mean, talking about some hardcore MAGA areas. They still lost them, but they increased their vote margin maybe by 2 or 3%, and they end up winning those seats. So that's the formula here. It sounds simple, but it's extremely hard to do.
Well, to your point, I mean, I remember
Yeah.
at the time,
Mhm.
so you have Senator Ossoff win, Senator Warnock wins, then he's
Mhm.
subject to an election. The next election cycle, he wins
Mhm.
it again.
Yeah.
Georgia, for conventional like wisdom, people say, what are Democrats even doing campaigning in Georgia? There's
Mhm.
no way because it had two incumbent Republican
Mhm.
senators.
Yeah.
And to
Yeah.
your point, we flipped it. And North Carolina currently has
Mhm.
two incumbent Republicans as well, Tom Tillis
Mhm.
and Tim
Mhm.
Budd. Ted Budd, yeah,
Ted.
yeah.
Yeah. Ted. But
Um,
yeah.
so again, so some of the parallels that you're drawing there are pretty interesting, I think pretty resonant.
Mhm.
I should also say that, again, for viewers, that when Doug mentions Stein, he is not referring to Jill Stein. He is referring to
To
incumbent
mm,
Attorney
yeah.
General Josh Stein,
Josh
who is
Klein.
running
Yes.
for governor here.
Correct. Correct.
Um, so listen, I can't imagine like the
Mhm.
optimism that you probably
Mhm.
feel given that when you
Mhm.
came down here, like the first major stake was President Obama's victory. Again, that was a
Mhm.
game changer. Before again we get into
Mhm.
deeper state
Mhm.
politics, has it been demoralizing or frustrating to see that momentum shift? President Obama wins in
Mhm.
2008, but the
Mhm.
electors in 2012,
Mhm.
2016, and 2020 all go to the Republican. Do you see it as a momentum shift? Did we, as Democrats, fail to do something? What
It's a
was the
lot.
situation there?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So, just just for transparency, when I worked on Obama's campaign in '08, I was a regional field director, which now they call a regional. a regional organizing director. That's the new term now. And my territory was Rock Hill, which for your viewers who don't know, Rock Hill is in South Carolina. Charlotte sits on the border of North and South Carolina. So we had Rock Hill, Chester County, and Lancaster County. These are all in the South Carolina. Not talking about Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And my job was to deliver those counties to Barack Obama in the primary in '07 and '08, and we were able to do that. Of course, you know how that would happen. So it has been frustrating because after the election, I think one of the mistakes that Obama did was he did not invest in the DNC. Like he took his campaign operations, which was probably the most successful Democratic campaign in American history, took that and made it run as a standalone operation that was focused on pushing his agenda, which weakened the DNC, which I believe led to the Republican takeover of 2010. Now, people don't really talk about the 2010 election. In my opinion, the 2010 election was the most consequential election in the last 20, 22 years, because that election shaped our politics to what we see today. That election gave us gerrymandering to a point where people that look like me, our votes are very much diluted. It also led to this extreme conservative agenda that our country hasn't seen before. And I know a lot of Republicans will get upset with me about that by saying that, but it's the truth. The Republicans that I remember growing up in the '80s and '90s would never push for a lot of the agenda items that this particular version of the party has right now. And thirdly, it led to the rise of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was able to, and Trump is someone that I don't know personally, of course, but growing up in New York, everybody knew about Trump. Trump was just like a regular guy. I apologize that he comes from my borough. He came from Jamaica, Queens, the same place that I was living.
I'm going to try not to blame you for him. Okay. I'll try not to. Yeah. Yeah.
but um, that election led to him, becoming the leader of the Republican Party and eventually becoming president. And so it has been demoralizing. It has been frustrating to now see that the country kind of went through a backlash of electing the first Black president with the hopes of us finally breaking away from the sins of our past, of Jim Crow, of slavery, of everything that went with that, to then electing a guy that was just the total opposite of what we elected, 8 years prior. And it and to see um, policies that were designed to help people trying to get rolled back, banning of books, banning of DEI training, and trying to erase the fact that we are a diverse country. Very frustrating, very demoralizing, and I am worried about, if Trump is reelected, what does that mean for the country? And also in the same breath, if Biden wins reelection, will there be another January 6th? So a lot of that is frustrating and demoralizing for me.
Yeah, I
Mhm,
can't imagine, so full disclosure again, before I moved to
mhm,
North Carolina, I spent most of my life in rural Kentucky,
mhm,
then in Louisville, Kentucky. So when you're talking about seeing license plates from all over, I guarantee
mhm,
you at some point, I'm not saying who, you may see an expired
mhm.
Kentucky license plate drive through. I'm not saying who it is. But it's so Charlotte in particular, but
Mhm,
North Carolina in general, like you said, seeing a population growth, it is, as I
mhm,
mentioned, a quasi battleground state, because even though certain things trend towards Republicans, if you
mhm,
look poll after poll after poll, Pew data,
mhm,
there tend to be more registered Democrats and more people who affiliate with the Democratic Party. It's like
mhm, mhm.
43 to 41% to the
Yeah.
Republican Party. And you mentioned gerrymandering, and that. So my
Mhm,
last question about state politics before we
mhm,
get
mhm,
into start to transition to the more local level.
mhm,
You mentioned how President Obama made a mistake with respect to his reelection campaign and setting the stage
mhm, mhm,
um, for future Democratic performance with his operations. Now,
mhm,
President Biden made it a mission, or at least public statements, that he was going to emphasize North Carolina's role
mhm,
within the
mhm,
Democratic Party. Were you pleased about that? Do you think he has followed through on that? What does that look like? Do you mind talking about that a
mhm.
little bit?
No, I don't mind. Yes, I am pleased that he has done that because in 2020, the Biden campaign did not fully start operating in the state until July of that year. And we believe, us who were on that campaign, believe if we had started maybe April or March of 2020, that we could have flipped the state because it clearly showed that North Carolina was the only state that Trump lost by the smallest margin. And so I think Biden then now coming back and hiring some top notch political operatives to who were on the campaign last time, who understand the state, and hired them in January of this year shows that he is very focused on flipping the state. And also, what Biden has done that I think doesn't get a lot of credit for, he invested in the DNC. He really did. He worked with them. He made sure that some of his campaign apparatus went over there. And look what it resulted in. It resulted in Democrats not getting blown out in 2022, which was Biden's first midterm as president. You look at Barack Obama's first midterm as president, he loses 60, 66 seats. So you can see why, although a lot of people talk trash about the state party or the national party, you still need a strong state Democratic Party and a strong DNC to help down ballot candidates. And that's why investing in the party is so important. But to go back to your original question, is yeah, I am satisfied and glad that the president invested in here early. Now the task comes of delivering on that goal of making sure that North Carolina is in the Democratic column in November.
In 2020, it was, I
Mhm.
think, the margin had been the smallest, as you said,
Yeah.
in years, if not decades.
Mhm.
And of course, that was during the pandemic year. Donald
Pandemic. Yeah.
Trump was historically unpopular at the time.
Mhm.
Now the situation's a bit flipped. It's so fascinating to me. And I know I said that that was the last
Mhm.
question about
No,
national
you're fine.
politics, but again, you
No, you're
said
good.
something which just triggered a
Yeah.
great tangent, which is
Mhm.
now the situation's somewhat flipped. You look at, like, take the economy for example. This is something I talk about on this channel all the time. The same
Mhm.
macroeconomic indicators that we've always used to evaluate the national economy under every president,
Mhm.
GDP growth, unemployment, whatever.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
truly impressive numbers under President Biden. He doesn't get the credit for it, even though
Mhm.
consumer sentiment is starting to rise. There seems to be a disconnect between the president's
Mhm.
agenda and his policies and people's perception of it. Even though I think you could easily make the case that Biden has helped influence the economy for the better in post pandemic recovery,
Mhm.
but I digress. President
Mhm.
Biden is struggling with respect to popularity. That's the fact is that we see it.
Mhm.
And also, he's running against another quasi incumbent. Donald Trump hasn't been the president, but he was the
Mhm.
president, right? What do you make
Mhm.
of this race compared to, excuse me, 2020? And what
Mhm.
are the unique challenges or opportunities in flipping North Carolina for the Democratic column in this particular election cycle with these two men and their two records?
Well, in 2020, like you said, we had a 100-year, a once in a lifetime pandemic that took place. President Trump at the time showed, and voters showed this in their vote, did not do a good job of managing that crisis. And as a result, Biden at the time, the country really respected him and felt like he was a statesman and sympathized with the losses that he has gone through, especially losing his son, Bo. He was speaking as a candidate that would come in and bring things back to normal and calm things down. He has done that. I think what has hurt him is things that he cannot control. One is his age. I think it's very unfair for voters to say, I'm not going to vote for this guy because he's 81, even though he showed you that he can probably do things that you and I can't do. And I've always said this, that you're talking about an 80-year-old man that's getting up probably earlier than you and I during the week, reading presidential briefings that shows to him how a lot of people across the world want to kill you and me. And then he has to deal with running the country. He's got to deal with a Congress. He's traveling all the time. And then, not to mention, he did the State of the Union at 9 o'clock at night on a Thursday and stood around till like midnight. You and I, if we did that, we're ready to go to bed at a certain time. So I feel like that he is not. I think that's something that you can't hold against him. He's not going to be the curious case of Benjamin Button. He's an old man now, and then by November he's looking like Brad Pitt. It's just not going to happen. And I also believe that the reason why you see the numbers the way they are now, in addition to him, his age and everything, is the country is so polarized. It's pretty hard for any president of any party to maintain a 50% approval rating 3 or 4 years for the presidency. Barack Obama didn't do it. I mean, Barack Obama, when he was up for re-election, granted his numbers a little bit better than Biden, but I think he was like in the low 40s. And I also believe, and I'll stop at this, is that one thing that hasn't changed, and the reason why the president is not getting high marks in the economy, it's a trend that voters do. Like when Obama came in, the country was during the Great Recession. And this always happens. It seems like whenever a Republican, at least in this century, when a Republican president is president, for some reason, the economy tanks. And then it tanks to the point where when when the Democrats come in, they're like, man, this is worse than what we thought. We have to use the full strength and power of the US government to fix this problem, which is going to require us to spend. And then the Republicans come and say, oh my God, look at that. They're spending all this money. It's going to cause this and that, blah, blah, blah. And they make a big deal about it. Everybody's on the same accord. Everybody has the same talking points. And the American people listen to that and say, yeah, you know what? Yeah, this spending is too much for me. I don't know about this. I'm going to put the same people back in power that caused the economy to crash anyway. And that's been happening throughout the century so far. And so now you have it where the economy is going great. It is. But because Republicans are masterful at talking about the economy in a way that voters who do not pay attention can grab onto that, then that leads to these poll numbers you're seeing where Biden is not getting high marks in the economy, but Trump is, because people remember the Trump economy, which was the Obama Biden economy that he inherited. So that, I know that was a long answer, but
No, I love that. I love that.
that's the reason why we keep going through this until the American people realize that, look, this isn't a both sides thing. It's proven in the last 24 years into the century now. In the last 24 years, this has happened. This has happened.
So the reason I know I love that answer, and the reason like I'm reacting the way I do is because a lot of these things we touch on this channel. So some of it's self-serving because I feel
Yeah.
you validating many of
Mm,
the analyses and interpretations I've had. Yeah. So to
mm,
put let's put some of this in perspective again for the viewers here. Number one, 10 out of the last 11 recessions, 10 out of the last 11 began under
mhm,
Republican presidents.
mhm,
And I understand, again, having grown up in rural Kentucky, the appeal of the claim of fiscal conservatism, and I'm sure you
mm.
understand that too.
Yeah.
Like
Mhm,
in intuitively, it makes sense. Kind of be thrifty a bit with your expenses, never spend more than what you're taking in. All of that is advice that we give to people on an interpersonal basis. Then you look at macro politics on a national
mhm,
level; it's a little bit more complicated than that.
mhm,
But Republicans have been fiscally irresponsible for decades. They spend as
Mhm.
much, if not more, than Democrats, I would argue, and I'm sure you would too,
Yeah.
on infinitely less important things, right? We're trying to
Mhm.
spend it on social safety nets and
Mhm.
keeping people out of starvation and poverty and death, and they have
Mhm.
other spending priorities like a $2 trillion
Yeah.
tax cut for the rich.
Yeah.
Um, and also, I love the fact that you point out that Donald Trump and Republicans are really good, and I would argue, Doug, and you again interrupt me if you disagree or if you
Mhm.
have a point if you want to challenge it. But I here at this channel, I feel like this is something I've said quite a bit. I feel like Republicans are constantly graded on a curve, not just
Mhm.
by their own party, but also by moderates and independents. So you mentioned the
Mhm.
Trump economy. This is a great example.
Mhm.
Time didn't begin when Donald Trump was inaugurated in January 2017. He inherited
Mhm.
an economy firing on all cylinders
Mhm.
from President Obama.
Yeah.
But none of that is ever contextualized. And I would argue that we on the left, we do a poor job of reminding people of that as well. That time did not
We do.
begin when Donald
Mhm.
Trump became president. And
Mhm.
then the other way,
Mhm.
Republicans, and I feel like a lot of moderates and independents as well, are just inclined to give 2020 as a bit of a mulligan to Trump.
Mhm.
Now, well, the pandemic wasn't his fault, so he shouldn't be caught with the blame for the economic consequences as well as the loss of life. And so
Mhm.
it's this
Mhm.
fascinating thing that Republicans are able to do where they can take all the credit for all the good stuff, but anything bad happens on their watch, it either didn't happen or it was somebody else's
Mhm.
fault. Have you noticed this as well in
Yeah,
your
I have.
professional work?
I have, and it's very frustrating. Like you bring up a good point. People would say, well, Trump didn't cause COVID, which he didn't. I mean, he didn't sit in a lab or whatever and create COVID. Um, but uh, he um, but he gets credit for the economy at that, the economy being good. Well, Afghanistan wasn't Biden's fault. That was created under a Republican president and with at the time with a Congress that went along with him because let's face it, the country was really pissed off after 9/11, so we were ready to go to war. But then Biden gets blamed for Afghanistan.
Right.
And again, you're right. For some reason, Republicans will argue me down about this, is saying that they are held to that Democrats are not held to a higher standard like they are. I call BS on that. I mean, before you and I just started talking today, an appeals court in my former home state of New York uh, just reduced Trump's bond from 464 million to 175 million.
And gave him
Now,
a
if
10-day extension on it and gave him a
gave him
10-day extension.
gave him a 10-day extension on it. So how is the system rigged for Democrats if this man is beating every case that's brought to him? So yeah, you are right on that. Like I have seen a trend in that, and it is very frustrating. And I don't know why the country tends to have this amnesia of what happened in 2020, and
How do you
why
fight it?
I think that one Democrats both in DC and here, and I think Democrats in North Carolina kind of get it. But Democrats as a whole have to realize that, and I always use this line from the movie The Town when John Hamm was investigating Ben Affleck and the bank robbing crew, and they were just beating the cops to in their own game or whatever. And John Hamm said that this is the we're not effing around crew. And this effing around has to go both ways. So the Republicans have showed us that they're not effing around with us. They are going to push their agenda. They don't give a damn who says anything about it. And they go with it with a lot of bravado that voters may not agree with, but they respect. Democrats have to show one, that we're Democrats and we're damn proud of it, and stop acting like you ain't a Democrat and you're scared to say that. I mean, just say it. That's one. And I think that what we have to figure out is explain to people when the notion comes to them that Democrats just tax and spend, tax and spend. That's not true. And here's why. Republicans, since probably in the 1980s, have ignored infrastructure in this country, have ignored the economic inequality in this country, have ignored the fact that there is a baby boomer population that's aging, and that Gen Xers, any young Gen Xers like myself have to start taking care of, and that's costing us money. And so when you have a Democratic president, the two that we've had this century so far, Obama and Biden, they both have come into their presidency during crises. Those crises have exposed what the financial um, outlook is for Americans here, and it's not good. Your average person can only save maybe $400 for a rainy day fund. Your average person is living paycheck to paycheck. Your average business owner is struggling. And so Biden comes in with the Build Back Better plan, which is literally designed to finally start closing a lot of these gaps and take that financial strain off Americans. Is was it going to happen overnight? But it was put there, and many on the right and some in the Democratic Party said it was too expensive. It was going to cause inflation. And the reason why we have to explain, I don't know, I'm still trying to grapple how to put this in a 30-second soundbite. But the reason why these things are so expensive, because the more you ignore them, the more expensive it gets. So, like, if you bought your house in 2006 and you trying to sell your house now in 2024 with the same doors and light fixtures that you have in your house, it's not going to sell, because you know why? That stuff is outdated. And when you try to repair all that stuff, you're like, man, this stuff is expensive because you waited too long to invest in your own house. It's the same thing with our country. If we continue just to push this off, oh, it's too expensive, but we got money to give to millionaires and billionaires. We got money to fight wars and all of that, but then we don't have money to invest in America here, to invest in its people, and that's what Biden was trying to do. Then you're always going to get this yin and yang, this tug of war, where Republicans come in, they cut taxes for rich people, expecting this 44-year-old economic plan that somehow trickled down to people like you and I. Then the economy goes to hell, and then the American people elect Democrats again. We come in, we have to fix things, which takes American government to do it, and we find out how things are so expensive because we're not fixing what's wrong with the American people.
Yeah. So again, so many things there that you said. I'm just thinking, like,
Mm,
even like the notion of trying to condense that to a 30-second
yeah.
soundbite. That's the other challenge I feel that Democrats have
Mm,
compared to Republicans, because, and again, I say this quite a bit on my channel. I don't think
mhm,
it's particularly controversial. The Republican Party, particularly in its current
mm,
iteration, is not a serious governing party. They're just not.
mhm,
They
mhm,
demonstrate this. I think in particular at the federal level, particularly in the House of Representatives, we see it. They're certainly dangerous. They certainly have their talents as an elected class. I'm not saying that Republican
mhm,
politicians are stupid. They're not,
mm,
but they're not a
mm,
serious governing party. Democrats have to do, it seems, all the governing, and they have to do it very often in spite of Republicans. I compare it
mhm,
to a three-legged race. Imagine you're in a three-legged race. It's complicated, but you should at least have the end destination in sight, even if you disagree about how to get there.
mhm.
Republicans in the three-legged race have dropped to the ground, and they're hugging our legs trying to thwart
Yeah,
progress.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's so maddening. And they get to govern, they get to campaign and govern with these buzzwords, and we have to
Mhm,
campaign and govern in prose, because that's actually how governing gets done.
mhm,
So it's
mhm,
so frustrating. You spoke to that so well. A couple of other things I
mm.
want to
Yeah,
remind the viewers as well. Again, polling isn't great for President Biden, but I will say at the time of recording, he is leading in the polls. It finally started to swing. We're not
mm,
hearing
mm,
about it, of course, because
yeah, we're not.
right. We only ever hear
Yeah,
the bad stuff on a national level about President Biden and the Democrats, but
yeah,
he is up in the polling over Donald Trump within the margin of error, and it may flip.
mhm,
You mentioned President Biden's age earlier. He has no
mm.
control over that, but so funny how Donald Trump is basically their peers. They could have gone to high school together, and he's
Right,
graded on a curve, Doug. I mean, he's just
right.
He says the craziest things all the
He
time.
does. He
He's
does.
profoundly uncurious. He says the most deranged stuff, but we got to create this false balance
Well,
here.
and I think I always compare it to this, right? So I am 45 years old, and your oldest millennial is like maybe 42, 43. That would be like a millennial that's 42 years old calling me old because I'm 45 and because I was born at the ending of the Gen X generation, that somehow I'm old, where me and that millennial could be in high school and college together. So, but we're basically peers, at least in that part of that, in part, and at least in the later part of their generation. And I think what it is this, and I'm really going to break this down to where I think nobody has talked about this. I think the reason why Trump doesn't get knocked on his age, because Biden does look older than Trump. And here's why Biden looks older than Trump. Because I know people in my family that have lost children, grown children. And the toll that puts on a parent at any age of losing their child, it ages you even more. So here's a guy that, if you look at Biden in 2016 and then look at him in 2019, you want to know what happened? He lost his son. That's the second child he's lost in his lifetime. So you lose your son, and then your dying son tells you, promise me, dad, that you will run for president. And so he's taken his grief, running for president, and then gets elected, and then has to deal with the stress of the presidency. That's going to age you. I mean, Obama came in the presidency. Obama was my age when he came into the presidency. He left with more gray hair than you and I got in our head, because the presidency is that bad. Trump has never had a hard day in his life. All right. He was born with a rich dad who gave him a couple of stacks. He was able to go to Manhattan, get involved in real estate. And I remember seeing this cat in the you see the Ghostbusters 2 thing behind me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big Ghostbusters fan. I remember he was in the Bobby Brown video. So the main video for that thing. He was in the video with Bobby Brown. So this guy never had a hard day in his life. But the current president we have has gone through hell, and that's why he looks the way he does. So any viewer on here, if you lost a child, wherever that child is, 30 or 10, you're going to look like hell a little bit afterwards, and it's going to age you more. And that's called grief. That's called grief. Like I lost my dad in 2022. I look at pictures of myself before my dad passed and after my dad passed. I look much older because of the grief and the trauma of losing somebody. And that's why he looks like that. It's nothing to do with him, losing his step. And the other thing I would say, Josiah, is that he stutters, and I'm a stutterer. And if you notice me talking to you, I've had to take my time and talk to you. When I'm taking my time and talking to you, I lose my train of thought sometimes. So I have to think about what you just told me, because I'm so focused on not stuttering. And stuttering doesn't leave you. It's something that you can manage. And that's why he looks like, sometimes you think he's, losing his step. No, he's trying not to stutter. He's trying to speak clear. And I think our country has to stop practicing this ageism that we're doing, and and um going after folks disabilities, and using that as a weapon against them. That is straight BS. That's not the country that we should be. Franklin Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. He had polio. Now, granted, he tried to hide it. And back then, the press was different, the country was different. But you didn't hear voters saying, we're not going to vote for Franklin Roosevelt because he's in a wheelchair. You didn't hear voters saying in Texas they're not going to vote for Greg Abbott because he's in a wheelchair. You didn't hear voters in New York saying that they weren't going to vote for, and I'm blanking on the governor that was blind. You didn't hear them say that. But then we have a president that's 80 years old, turning 81, was able to stand up and give a speech with vigor for 2 hours, and your average American gets tired from doing push-ups for 10 minutes, and then we're going to say that this guy is too old? No, So I'm sorry,
No,
I kind of
so
went on a tangent there.
no, no, listen, I
Mhm,
appreciate that because the thing that and you hit on it in your second point, and this is what I thought you were
mhm,
gonna lead with,
mhm.
which was the actual stress of the presidency. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
100% people
yeah.
say Donald Trump is the same. And by the way, I think you could easily make the case Donald Trump is not
He's
the
not.
same
Yeah.
guy as he was in 2016 or even in
Mhm,
2020.
mhm,
But it has nothing to do with the stress of the job. I mean, physically, he looks very, very similar. And to your
mhm.
point, that tends not to be the case when you actually do the job of the presidency, the
Yeah.
toughest, most powerful, most influential job in the
Mhm,
world. I completely agree. So you could easily look at that as proof that
mhm.
Donald Trump was likely kicking back and enjoying himself during
Yeah.
his 4 years in power. So I think that that's a phenomenal point that needs to be emphasized. Also, the points about grief and Biden's stutter as well. But yeah, it's
Mhm,
just these two men are held to wildly different standards,
mhm,
and it's so frustrating because Biden can still talk substantively about domestic and foreign policy,
mhm,
improvisationally, contemporaneously. Yes, his verbal agility may be slower
mhm,
due to age and grief and the stutter, but
mhm,
his competence and his
mhm,
comprehensive understanding, it's all there. Donald Trump could not talk
mhm,
about the intricacies of the war between Israel and Hamas or
mhm,
Ukraine and Russia or
mhm,
why, the American Rescue Plan did that. Donald Trump couldn't talk about Donald Trump, I guarantee if you asked him now, how did your two
mhm,
COVID stimulus bills help the country?
mhm.
He would have to say things like, well, just everybody says they
Yeah,
were phenomenal. Like
yeah,
he
yeah.
couldn't talk about this stuff. So it's
Mhm,
just so frustrating to me. And I appreciate you, taking
mhm,
that apart at length. Now I will talk
mhm.
to you about state politics if you've got
Uh-huh.
a few minutes
Yeah,
left.
yeah, yeah.
So again, just to recap for the viewers, North Carolina tends to trend in terms of its presidential electors towards the Republicans. I think it was Jimmy
Mhm.
Carter and President Obama who
Yeah.
won
Mhm,
in the
mhm,
past, however many years.
mhm,
But we have two, and yes, we have two Republican
mhm,
senators, but we have an incumbent, term limited Democratic governor, Roy Cooper. We have,
mhm,
again, according to polling, you have basically a 50-50 split. If anything, it favors Democrats in terms of voter identification, voter affiliation.
mhm,
So this is not a deep red state in terms of
mhm,
composition. As a matter of fact, Doug, as I'm sure you're aware, and I'm sure it makes you mad because it makes me
mhm,
mad, until recently, we had a 7-7 congressional split. You mentioned
mhm,
a Congressman Jeff Jackson who's running for the
mhm,
Attorney
mhm,
General's office. So let's talk about gerrymandering for a minute. What the heck's
mhm,
going on in North Carolina? Wisconsin's starting to get its act together, right? We saw a reversal of Wisconsin's voting maps, but what is
mhm.
going on in North Carolina for a state that's so 50-50?
Again, the Republicans, and I've had to work with some of them in my line of work, and one of my good friends is a Republican. I'm not going to mention his name. I don't want him to get in trouble. And but they, again, this goes back to the "we're not effing around" crew, right? When they were able to take control in 2010, since the first time since the Civil War, I believe they looked at the next 10 years and said, okay, we know the state's growing. We know that it's becoming more diverse. In order for us to lock in our power, we need to start gerrymandering. And we're going to gerrymander in a way that we will have control, complete control, not just over General Assembly, but the congressional delegation. And I believe that they said, and they've said this part to me too, that they learned how to do this from Democrats. That they keep saying, "Oh, we learned from Mark Besnight when he was the Senate pro tem back in the early 2000s, and how you know uh, they gerrymandered the state." And my pushback has always been like this. I remember 2002. And I clearly remember there was a equal number of Democrats and Republicans going to Washington from North Carolina. It was always either 7-7 or, whatever, or 7-6, and it was balanced. And when that happened again, in 2022, I think Republicans feel it's their God-given right to be in charge to the point where they have absolute power. And what has happened here is by doing that, and of course, adding in Representative Cotham, they've been able to push many conservative issues that I believe many voters in the state do not want. I think voters in the state could have a debate on whether their tax policy was good or whether or not their policy on reducing crime or whatever. But when you start going into areas of um, reducing the rights for women when it comes to reproductive rights, or attempting to do other um, or to push um, conservative agendas that they see in other states here, it becomes a problem. And what has happened with them having absolute power is also weakening the office of governor to now where I remember I raised this point to them, and I'm a big movie buff. So I'm always quoting movies. I said, you guys are like Michael Corleone in The Godfather 2 when Tom Hagen said, Mike, you won. Do you want to wipe everybody out? Like I said to them, I was like, look, you guys won. Do you want to wipe everything out? You have to control everything? And I've told them it's going to be very interesting. God forbid if Mark Robinson wins, are you going to keep that same power from Mark Robinson? And they told me yes. I said, okay, I want to see you tell this guy he's the first black governor the state's ever had. He came from poor Greensboro. He was an insurance agent to lieutenant governor to governor. They're going to tell this guy that he can't do what he want to do. So um, yeah, and I think that that has been the reason why it's been so hard for Democrats to flip, because when these counties and these districts are gerrymandered, Democrats have to again juice up turnout in these urban areas so high to offset these gerrymandered districts in the rural parts of our state. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on.
No, I really appreciate this. And Liz, this is not a pop politics channel. We talk,
Mm,
we like to
mm,
talk about this stuff at length because I feel very
yeah.
passionate about it as a resident
Mm,
of the state and also somebody who
mm,
saw it. So I campaigned with Progressive Victory in March of last year in
mm,
Wisconsin to help flip
mm,
that Supreme Court race for Justice Janet
mm,
Protasiewicz, the liberal. And that was
mm,
a monumental decision, and a monumental outcome, which has had an enormous trickle down effect in terms of making
mm,
Wisconsin more democratic. And I
mm,
recall from the research I did at the time that while Wisconsin was generally considered the
mm,
most absurdly gerrymandered state in the country, North
mm,
Carolina was up there given its composition. I mean, again, right now,
mm,
so we talked about how there was a congressional parity, 7 Republicans, 7
mm,
Democrats going to Washington. Now, under
mm,
Republican gerrymandered maps, because they flipped the Supreme Court here in this state, they
mm,
have a supermajority, to your point, because of a Democratic defector, Tricia Cotham, who I've made multiple videos about. I
mm,
think what she did was absurdly unethical. She flipped party affiliation months after being sworn into office, campaigning as a progressive Democrat. She gave the Republicans the one vote they needed to have a veto proof supermajority. And what
mm,
have Republicans done with these advantages in the Supreme Court and with their General Assembly supermajority? They rewrote
mm,
the damn maps again. And so now
mhm, mhm,
Republicans are slated to pick up 3 to
mhm.
4 seats. We might very well end up with an 11 seat Republican delegation and 3 Democrats. I mean, just heavily
Yeah,
lopsided
that's
in a state with
possible.
50-50. It's
That's possible. Yeah,
well, I was just going to say, so like
yeah.
your point where Republicans, when they have power,
Mhm,
they treat it as something to use. They treat it as a tool. And again, full disclosure on this channel, we advocate for ruthless democratic politics. I'm not
mhm,
saying that you have to go as far in all areas as
mhm,
Republicans do, but it is my opinion. And again, feel free to, if you disagree,
mhm,
it's my opinion that Democrats can no longer play the game of politics against this iteration of the Republican Party, both in North Carolina and at the federal level, um,
Mhm.
expecting that Republicans will restrain themselves, that we can
Mhm.
have the fight of politics. And again, I use it as a metaphor with Marquis of Queensberry rules, where we observe
Mhm.
norms and whatnot. Norms
Mhm.
require reciprocal good faith, and if you have
Mhm.
one side that is not acting in good faith, and the second they have an advantage, they will act to entrench it in perpetuity.
Mhm.
You have to start playing a bit more ruthlessly. That's why I like the fact that Jeff Jackson's a great example. He's
Mhm.
gone viral as a member of
Mhm.
Congress with his very blunt
Mhm.
dialogues with his voters in his wonderful campaign ad when he decided he was going to run for
Mhm.
attorney general. He
Mhm.
adopted the fighting rhetoric. Again, not irresponsible, but he's like, listen, Republican elected officials, corrupt, powerful actors in North
Mhm.
Carolina will
Mhm.
fear me as attorney general. Like, he brought an energy and a complete lack of timidity. And I want to see that from the Democratic Party. I want to see them, rebalance the landscape as much as possible and not simply accept it as is. So,
Mhm.
to your point, Republicans are not effing around. What
Mhm.
should Democrats do to not F around? Because to me, it's like, for an example, we'll use Wisconsin. Wisconsin,
Mhm.
when they redrew their maps recently, they still gave the Republicans a slight advantage in the congressional voting maps. Whereas
Mhm.
you could easily make the case, I'm not saying that they need
Mhm.
do this. They had the
Mhm.
opportunity to do to Republicans what Republicans have done to them. Where do you strike that balance, Doug? Like, in terms of wanting to fire Democrats up and get them to also not F around in the game of politics in 2024, given that lives are on the line, without
Mhm.
going overboard. Is that does that make sense? Like, how do you
No,
strike that
it
balance?
does. I have a lot to say on this. So,
Please take it away.
I would start off with this. The first part you said, I'm going to leave that for the second half of my statement. But um, I think the reason why Republicans have been so successful here with gerrymandering, with the things that they've done, is although many people may not believe this because of who the Republican Party has nominated for their council of state ticket, but the Republicans in the General Assembly are not like national Republicans. They are very gentlemanlike. They come at you with a good Southern accent, aw shucks, sipping iced tea type swag about them. And when you meet them, you're like, oh my God, these guys are so nice. How can they do the things that they're doing? And and the ones that I've met, they are, and I know I make it ding, but they are actually good people. I mean, they talk to you, they treat they. I've had good conversation with them. It's just their policies, I believe, are horrible, and I think that's benefited them. They're not scary. They're not like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, like this MAGA, zealot. They don't present themselves like that. Their policies, however, reflect where the party is now. That's how they're successful. If you like look at Ted Budd. Ted Budd, you wouldn't even know Ted Budd is a MAGA guy. He's so quiet. He's not looking for the cameras. He's not like the Republicans in the House trying to kick out the speaker every 5 seconds. You don't hear you just don't hear from the guy, right? And so you have that type of Republican in the state. That's how they're able to do it, because one thing Republicans know in the state, which is why it's going to be very interesting to see how the state votes in November. They know the state does not like politicians on both sides to embarrass them, to embarrass the state. So that's one. So, and then two, going back to the second half of your question, I think the Democrats need to, both at the national level and here in North Carolina, they need to present their agenda, say to the voters of North Carolina, if you elect us, this is what we will promise to do for you. A good example is of that is in 2018 when I was working for the state party. That year we flipped. No, we didn't flip. We broke the supermajority in the House, so we were able to add some good, strong Democrats in the House and Senate that we ended up losing in 2022. A lot of that people would say, well, it was a midterm year, it was a bad year for Republicans, et cetera, et cetera. But we had something called the Carolina Promise, and we created a standalone website for it, and we listed in layman's terms what our agenda is for education, for the economy, for healthcare, for infrastructure. We laid it out, and every candidate we had on the ballot that year talked about the Carolina Promise, and it worked. So I think what we have to do is, especially in the House here, we can't wait for the Republicans to say, "Okay, this is going to be the agenda for this session." I promise you, if it was reversed, Republicans would say no. They will have like a press conference, or they will go on TikTok or something and say, "This is our agenda for North Carolina for this session." So that's what Democrats have to do here, and they have to share that with the base. It has to be something that is tangible. See, what Republicans do, they say we're going to cut your taxes, or we're going to close this loophole to help this small business. And so, for a voter that's not engaged, that sounds nice. That sounds something they can grab to. But we're coming to them and saying, well, if you elect us, we will push our our plan to reduce carbon emissions from this level to that level by 2030, and we're going to increase minimum wage. And voters going to be like, I hear that, but how is that going to stop me from living paycheck to paycheck? How is that going to take the stress off of me of sending my kids through college? That's what we have to speak to. And that's what Republicans are doing to a certain extent, but they're doing it in a way that is only resonating with a certain section of voters, though. Yeah,
Yeah, and they've definitely
yeah,
rigged the game in their favor with
yeah,
respects, not obviously not vote counts, but in terms of
mhm,
creating a structure or
yeah,
exacerbating the structure which advantages them. And
mhm,
again, we talked about the media discrepancies, but it's
mhm,
frustrating really to see it at a civic level too, where you
mhm,
have these gerrymandered districts, you have where Democrats have to constantly overperform both at the federal level and the state level in a state like North Carolina just to break
mhm,
even. And my hope is we've seen some change with respect to Wisconsin. Hopefully, in the next election cycle or a few election cycles, we'll start to see that with North Carolina as well, where Democrats will win elections and then act decisively. I
mhm,
hope we take our cue from Wisconsin in that respect. Like, listen, if you elect Democrats, we will immediately break this Republican gerrymander. We give them no quarter. We're undoing it. It doesn't matter how many times they ask nicely. This will be forced to be a 50-50 state again if
mhm,
Democrats take power, which, of course, the first step is electing them.
mhm, mhm,
You mentioned extremists. We got Mark Robinson as the current incumbent lieutenant governor running to replace Governor Cooper. Um,
mhm.
how do you feel about Stein versus Robinson ahead of the November election?
Well, one thing that a lot of folks are starting to talk about that I mentioned a year ago is the one thing that is interesting about this race is that voters will either elect the first black governor or the first Jewish governor. That would be historic. Secondly, I think like any race in North Carolina, it's going to be a close race. Um, I believe that Stein will come out on top because I think that Robinson's comments on the civil rights movement and on Dr. King is going to hit African Americans to our core, because we know that I wouldn't be able to talk on this platform with you or live in this house, if Dr. King and the civil rights movement did not do what they did. Uh, because up until that point, the country at that time was operating in an apartheid state, from 1865 or longer than that up until 1960. Um, and so when you pervert that cause with comments like he said, I think that would hurt him among African American voters. And I think that would galvanize African Americans to a point where they would come out and vote against him. I still think it's a 50-50 shot. I know I don't want to scare your viewers on this. I wouldn't be surprised if Mark Robinson won. because at the end of the day, we are in a southern state where the Democratic Performance Index is about 45, 46%. And so Republicans already start off with an advantage of maybe 5 points or 4 points. So he's got that going for him. But I would not be surprised if Stein wins because the state has showed a trend of trusting Democrats with the governor's mansion, but rewarding Republicans with the House and the Senate and the congressional delegation. Of course, a lot of that is due to gerrymandering. But in the end, I believe that this race for governor could really do two things for our state. It could continue us on this trajectory that we're going of Medicaid expansion, of having the reputation of a big business friendly state, to having a governor, albeit historic, be the topic of news, national news every single day. And to the viewers and people watching, the reason why Josiah and I spent so much time earlier on this conversation talking about national politics is because North Carolina is now part of the national ethos of politics because of our governor's race, because we're a battleground state. So things that happen nationally will affect us here locally in North Carolina more than any state, say a New York or a Maryland, or even to some extent, even a Wisconsin.
What would it mean?
Mhm,
You know, right now the Republicans enjoy a supermajority in the General Assembly. I expect that that's not likely to change, you think, in the
mhm,
next
mhm,
election? So what would it
mhm,
mean if they get, let's say, the governor's mansion? Like basically, if they get a trifecta here in the state, they already have the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, I should also mention that there is an
mhm.
incumbent Democrat
Yes.
Supreme Court
Mhm,
justice who is up for
mhm,
reelection. Actually, sidebar on that race and on the Attorney General's race. How
mhm.
do you feel about those two races? Because for one, you have an incumbent
Okay.
in the Supreme Court, and but the Attorney General, Stein is running for governor, so it's Jeff Jackson versus Dan Bishop for Attorney General. How do you feel about those two races?
That's going to be a one to watch too. You have a millennial candidate in Jeff Jackson who has mastered the ability to communicate with voters better than any member of the Congress has, even better than the Biden campaign. And I think that a lot of Democrats should take lessons from Jeff. And I know I'm biased here because I worked for Jeff, or not work, but I worked for Jeff. Um, but I think that that race is going to come down to probably a 1 or 2% um, percentage point. Um, and I think that in order for Jeff to be successful here, is to not only do what he's doing on TikTok, but to do what he did when he was running for Senate, when he was going across the state, having these town halls and really speak to voters. Because one thing he has over Bishop is he's able to speak directly to voters where they can understand. Here's an example. I have a friend of mine that lives, albeit he doesn't live in North Carolina. He lives in Fort Mill. He is what I would call MAGA light. He didn't like Trump, but he liked DeSantis. Thinks Biden is too old, doesn't like Biden, doesn't like Clinton, but loves Jeff Jackson. That's an interesting guy. Here's a guy that's more of a libertarian guy that was voting for DeSantis, but likes Jackson. And I'm hearing that more and more that there are Trump voters that will vote for Trump, but vote for Jeff because they like what Jeff is saying. And so I think if Jeff can continue this somewhat, I call Tom Cruise meets populist movement going on, because I always say he looks like Tom Cruise a little bit. You know, he kind of has this maverick meets populism combined in a millennial type way. I think that he could really give Dan Bishop a run for his money, because all Dan is going to talk about is the usual Republican talking points. He's for open borders. He is for communist China because he's on TikTok. You know, he's for raising taxes. But I think Jeff can say, "Look, guys, I was in the Congress with this guy. This is what really went on." And And I really think Jeff has a good shot of winning. I really it's not gonna be easy because Dan Bishop is a force. He's a force. But I see that race being tight. And then you asked about another race too, right? The Supreme Court, yes. You see, there's an example. I'm not an old guy, and I forgot what you said. All right. So the Supreme Court is extremely important. And here's why. Um, Before the election of 2022, the Supreme Court was led by Democrats here in North Carolina and was able to push back a lot on the voter laws that the Republicans were pushing, in particular, gerrymandering, voter ID, whatever. When that happened, I don't know if anybody was paying attention to this, in about August of 2022, the Republicans again said to themselves, "We're not going to let this crap happen," and started shifting money towards their judicial candidates and spent a lot of money putting commercials up on the airways that showed these two sheriffs from rural North Carolina talking about how liberal and woke this judicial candidate is that was a Democrat winning, that were running. And they were able to push that message and they were able to flip the Supreme Court. And so now we have Allison Riggs who's running in her own right because she was appointed by Governor Cooper to finish out the term of Mike Morgan. And then also you have Carolyn Thompson, who ran for the North Carolina Court of Appeals in 2022 and lost, and was appointed by the governor, and now is running in her own right. Those two seats are just as important, if not more important, than the gubernatorial seats because the Republicans have been able to get by with their agenda because they control the courts. And that's why they've been always focused on the courts for the past 3 or 4 decades, because in their mind, they're saying, if we get bowled out of power, our policies still live on in these conservative justices in these conservative justices. So Democrats have to get really serious about these judicial races because that's where these battles are being fought. The battles that we can't win at the ballot box are being shifted over to the judicial system. I mean, to the judicial branch, excuse me. And sometimes we win there, sometimes we're losing there because we are not put in a position of power to appoint these judges and also get them elected.
Yeah, no, listen, I think on this channel, excuse me, on this channel quite a bit, we emphasize the role of the judiciary. Obviously, at the federal level,
Yeah.
we haven't had a
Mhm.
liberal majority on the United States Supreme Court in 50 years, but also, again,
Mhm.
even at the state level, in states, again, like North Carolina and Wisconsin, it is vital
Mhm.
that liberals or progressives, those of us who are not in line with this MAGA right wing agenda, control the
Mhm.
courts. And
Mhm.
listen, I say this as somebody who thinks we need to seriously look at some like Supreme
Mhm.
Court and state Supreme Court
Mhm.
changes in this country, because to me it is absurd the disproportionate power that
Mhm.
courts wield over the elected branches. To me, that is not in line
Mhm.
with a truly functional democracy. The courts in there to provide the guardrails, but the vast
Mhm.
majority of governing in this country was always intended to be done
Mhm.
by legislatures and
Mhm.
executives at the state and the
Mhm.
federal level. And we're seeing a shift in that.
Mhm.
But if that's where the battleground is, to your point, and it is, whether
Mhm.
we like it or not, the
Mhm.
Democrats have got to get serious about
Mhm.
shifting the balance of these courts in our
Mhm.
favor.
Mhm.
Last question for you. You mentioned Mark Robinson. We have a Republican supermajority in the state assembly. We have it on the Supreme Court. If he is elected,
Mhm.
can you please tell my viewers, some of whom are no doubt in North Carolina, what that would mean if Republicans secure a trifecta this election?
If Republicans secure a trifecta in this election, you can see North Carolina start to become more like its counterpart over the border, like South Carolina, where you would have complete Republican autonomy to pass whatever they want without any debate to help alter that course to reflect a more equal level of support across the state. And I know that didn't make any sense there, but what I'm trying to say is that um, without the guardrails that would be in place. Let's say if we broke the supermajority and then they had to really work with Democrats to get things done. Um, the state is better if the state feels, if voters here feel like they want to have the divided government, um, they can see, if Republicans are willing to work with Democrats, they will see more things get done, and things that we've been pushing for years we could probably get past. But if it's Republican control, they are going to follow in lockstep with what other states have done, albeit not with the same anger that other Republicans are doing it, but they would do it in a way that's very methodical, that's very not in your face, and you would just start hearing about different things changing. And that trifecta will be hard. That trifecta will be hard. Will be hard to break.
If people say, "Well, Doug,
Mhm.
surely if Republicans take a trifecta, surely they will be noble in victory. They won't push through a relentless agenda. They will be aware and appreciate the fact that half the
Mhm.
state votes Democrat, even if it's not reflected in the government." What do you say to
Mhm.
people who say that?
I say that whenever a candidate or a party wins an election, they believe they were elected to carry out their agenda. So Republicans will say voters put us in complete control, which means that they agree with our policies. That's not always the case. When you win an election, it's it does come down to messaging, but it comes down to strategy, and it comes down to getting your people out in higher numbers than the other side. And so that's why they're winning. They're winning because one, it is a gerrymandered state, and two, they are getting more folks to turn out on their side in those districts to keep them in power. And so they're going to say what I said earlier, that they're going to push this agenda because they believe that's what the North Carolina voters want. They have a mandate, and they're going to push that mandate. And so they would justify it by saying we've been put in charge. And that is and that's what we're facing. And I feel like we need to really start talking to where people are. So one thing that I admire about what you're doing is that not too many folks that classify themselves as Democrat or progressive are doing these type of YouTube channels. When I'm on YouTube, I see more stuff from conservatives, from some MAGA folks. And what I've noticed too, and just to talk about Trump briefly, is, which I feel this is amazing, is that there are former mob guys that I remember seeing in New York when I was growing up there in the '80s that are now changed and have their podcasts and are Trump supporters, and then talking about how Biden is unethical and destroying the country. Are you freaking kidding me right here, right now? I mean, you got Michael Franchese, who was a capo in the Colombo family. He's got his own podcast. You got Sammy the Bull, who was the biggest rat in New York. He's got his own podcast. You got the mob. You got the mob boss of Philly. He's got his own podcast. These three guys are Trump supporters, and so I would say that I would like to see more Josiah's on YouTube talking like this and explaining, what's really going on, because Republicans are starting to dominate in the YouTube circle as well. I've seen that.
Yeah, they definitely. I mean, we could probably have a 4-hour
Mhm.
conversation about the
Yeah.
various advantages in this country that Republicans
Mhm.
have. I say, to me, it's like, people who play video games, Republicans play the video game of politics on the easiest
Mhm.
difficulty with all the cheat codes enabled. And
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
Democrats, it's the opposite. We are playing on the
Mhm.
hardest difficulty.
Mhm.
Things are just
Mhm.
artificially harder by nature. And we have to, everywhere we can, push. So I really appreciate what you're doing. It
Mhm.
sounds like, again, that if Robinson is elected,
Mhm.
that trifecta will have tangible negative effects for
It
voting
will.
rights and reproductive
Mhm.
rights, and
It will.
and
Yeah.
also
Mhm.
from what it sounds like, and you've worked with them and against them, that we
Mhm.
can't trust that they'll just exercise restraint in grace
Yeah.
if they achieve victory. Half
Yeah.
the state, supports the Democratic agenda, so
Mhm.
we'll just go easy on it. No, we should probably assume that they will
Mhm.
do a full court press if they win these elections. So
Yeah. Yeah. They will, and you can't blame them. They'll have the power. They'll have the power, and they'll use it. That's what I can't knock Republicans for that. When they get power, they use it, and they use it effectively. And when we get power, I don't know. We always squander it. We don't message it right, and then by August of the year, we take power. The voters are pissed off at us. You know. Yeah.
to your point, but that goes back to, and I think
Mhm.
that there's quite a bit of agreement between us that this is
Mhm.
something about the Democratic Party that has to change. Again,
Yeah.
I'm not saying go full MAGA, go full,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I'm saying take a bit of that ethos that when you
Mhm.
have power, when the voters award you with power, they expect you to
Mhm.
wield that power decisively to
Mhm.
the people's benefit. And I
Yeah.
feel like very often, President Biden has accomplished quite a bit given his margins. He's a great example of someone who has done
Mhm.
better than I thought he
Mhm.
would, given what he's up against. I know a lot of people, look back at President Obama's administration and say he played too
Mhm.
nicely with Republicans. I think there's some merit to that, but I also
Mhm.
think that now we're in a different era where Democrats, when they are granted power, they
Mhm.
should use that power decisively. And if Republicans cry foul, who cares? They do it to us
They
for
do it all
terrible
the time to
policies,
us.
terrible
Yeah.
unpopular policies.
Yes, and
We
yeah.
should be doing it too for popular, positive
Mhm.
policies.
And I'll end with this. When Biden was running in 2019, I was one of the very few Biden supporters here in North Carolina. Everybody was saying they weren't really talking about his age that much. They were, but they were talking about that he's too moderate, and and he's a white man. He's a old, all of that stuff. And I said again, going back, I'm a movie buff. The line from New Jack City, I said we need a New Jack cop to take out a New Jack gangster. And what I meant by that is Biden has showed this. He has done this better. Um, the only person to do it like that was Clinton, because you're right. Obama didn't do it, and Obama couldn't do it, and that's a whole nother conversation. No, I'm talking about why he couldn't do it. Biden has went toe to toe with Republicans in State of the Union, and he still don't get props from Democrats. I mean, he's getting the props, but it's not like he would. I think he should get more. That he's showing us he's willing to fight. He does fight. He doesn't. And I'm not knocking what Obama did with Michelle. With the when they go low, they go high. No, no. Biden's like, look, you're gonna come at me. I'm gonna come right back at you, and that's what he did in the State of the Union. When they shouting at him, he shout right back to them. And then he gets so um, he has shown us that we can debate the Republicans, do it in a way that's, he did it in a respectable way. He didn't call them names and nothing like that. Do it in a respectable way, but then show that vigor and that decisiveness. He showed us that. So we need to do the same thing.
I completely agree. So,
Yeah.
Doug, where can people find you? And if you want to throw like one, like last, like, what do you want viewers to take away from this conversation? Which, by the way, I've loved. I feel like we could talk movies and politics for
Yeah.
hours at a time. Where can
Mhm.
they find you, and what is the final takeaway?
So on Twitter, you can find me at Wilson Alexander. So it's my last name, my middle name. And then on Instagram, you can find me at DA Wilson 78. So it's D as in Doug, A as in Alexander, Wilson 78. I am on Instagram. I'm still trying to get my TikTok up, so don't laugh at me about that. But I would say the best place to find me would be on, I'm still calling it Twitter. I know it's X. Well, I guess you say X, and then you can find me on Instagram. I would say my last point is, don't, to the viewers here, don't let your anger cloud your judgment. Don't feel like, oh, I don't like the way the war in with Israel Hamas is going. Oh, my rent's still too high, or I'm still living paycheck to paycheck. Don't let the anger coming from that cloud your judgment on who should be in the White House. Because right now, for the first time in history, we have two men that's running, both have been president. One was just president 4 years ago. We have one that's currently president now. And they could not be any different. And I know I've heard people say, and I think many of your viewers may believe this, oh, well, if I do a protest vote, who cares? I survived Trump last 4 years ago. This is a different Trump. You know, just like, you remember in Godzilla 2014, when he came back in Godzilla Kong, he looked mad different, right? And so this is going to be a different Trump with people around him that are going to do whatever he says to do. You remember last time he was in there, he had some old school Republicans that were telling him, nah, you can't do this, you can do that, restraining him. Now he's like, you know what? Blank all this, I am going after everybody. He's going to get in there. He's going to be pissed off if he gets in there. He's already pissed off right now. He's going to be more pissed off if he gets in there, and it's not going to be 2017. It's not. And so don't let your anger cloud your judgment when you vote. Try not to do that, and just know, like Obama said, change happens, but change happens slowly. You have to keep building on that change for it to fully take effect.
Listen,
Yeah.
Doug, I really appreciate it. Thank you for your
Mm.
time. We need to
You're
have future
welcome.
conversations, especially as
Yeah.
it gets closer to the election. Would love your insight, and I
Mhm.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.